Reno's men came down Reno Creek. They were seen by two young men who went up Reno Creek to get a horse that had been wounded in the Rosebud fight. 2 Bear was killed by Reno scouts. Lone Dog, the other, went back and gave the alarm, riding from side to side. Feather Earring saw him signaling the soldiers were coming, calling, "One of us got killed. They are right close behind me." He had no sooner arrived than Reno's command began firing in the teepees. Feather Earring was fighting against Reno. His brother was killed there. Reno was driven across the river into the hills and began to dig in the ground. He was fought by the Cheyennes and Ogallala's. It was thought at first that Reno's was Crook's command. War parties went to watch Crook, but he had gone back. Some war parties had gone down the Rosebud and had seen a steamboat and soldiers, but had not come back. Reno left the bottom for the hills because the Indians were surrounding him in the attempt to cut him off from his train. It was thought at first that Reno's command was alone. He was fought by the Cheyennes and Ogallala's. Many came from lower down, but about the time Reno reached the hill, word came that the village was being attacked by Custer below. They then left Reno's front for the lower end of the village, but when they got there from Reno's front, it was all over. Custer struck the Hunkpapas. He did not come across the river. He fired on the village. The Indians had crossed the Greasy Grass Creek, Little Bighorn, above where Custer tried to cross in great numbers and cut him off from Reno. They got around behind, east, him. They made their main stand on the ridge where the monument now is. They fought very hard. I had put my brother's body in the bushes and came down where Custer was. The fight was over. I drove 5 horses across the river. Gray horses. They were all wounded and trembling. I saw they were mortally wounded and let them go and went back toward Monument Ridge. About 200 yards from the river, I saw 2 bodies and went to look at them. One was a dead Indian, the other a white man alongside him. I saw the white man's heart beating and called to a Sioux. "Your grandfather has been killed by that man alongside of him. I don't think he is dead. You had better shoot him." He came up and put an arrow through him. He jumped up and was shot and killed by another arrow. He had been playing dead. There were no other marks on him than the 2 arrow wounds. Feather Earring judged the time of Custer's death by what he saw in the village that day. The women and children had gone out to gather berries and had already returned. By that measure, he believed it was around midday when the sun stood high. He believed that if Custer had kept his soldiers together and attacked at first light, the people would have scattered at first. But he was certain they would not have stayed away. They would have returned to fight. Looking back, he thought it was a mistake that Custer chose the open ridge instead of moving into the brush, where the ground offered cover. Custer did not turn back toward Reno because he could not. Large numbers of warriors had already moved in that direction and cut him off. Feather Earring said that if Custer had come forward to speak, rather than firing on the village, there had been an agreement among the people that they would surrender and go in with him peacefully. He could name 16 Sioux who were killed in the fighting. 4 of them fell near Reno's position, and 3 were Cheyennes. There were many more wounded than killed. The dead were carried back and placed on scaffolds within the village, according to custom. I remember well. None of us who were there could forget. I was almost 18 that summer. Never before or since that time did my people gather in such great numbers. Our camp on the Greasy Grass, Little Bighorn, stretched 4 miles along the river. 6 great camp circles, each a half-mile across, with thousands of Lakota fighting men and their families. In that long-ago time, none of my people knew more than 1,000 numbers. We believed no honest man needed to know more than that many. There was my own tribe, the Miniconjou. There were our cousins, the Hunkpapa, the Sanzark, the two kettles, the Sihasapa, Blackfoot Sioux, the Brule, and the Oglala, all our 7 council fires. There were many of our eastern relatives, too, the Yankton and the Santee, and our kinsmen from the north were there, the Yanktonai and the Assiniboine. Our friends and allies, the Cheyenne, were there in force, and with them were smaller bands of Arapaho and Gros Ventre. It was a great village, and we had great leaders. Hump, Fast Bull, and High Backbone led my tribe. Crazy Horse headed the Oglala. Lank Paduta, Scarlet Tip, led the Santee. Lame White Man and Ice Bear led the Cheyenne. But the greatest leader of all was the chief of the Hunkpapa, Sitting Bull. As long as we were all camped together, we looked on him as head chief. We all rallied around him because he stood for our old way of life and the freedom we had always known. We were not there to make war, but if need be, we were ready to fight for our sacred rights. Since the white man's government had promised our leaders that we could wander and hunt in our old territory as long as the grass should grow, we did not believe the white soldiers had any business in our hunting grounds, that they came to attack us anyway. I slept late the morning of the fight. The day before, I had been hunting buffalo, and I had to ride far to find the herds, because there were so many people in the valley. I came back with meat, but I was very tired. So when I got up, the camp women were already starting out to dig for wild turnips. 2 of my uncles had left early for another buffalo hunt. Only my grandmother and a 3rd uncle were in the teepee, and the sun was high overhead and hot. I walked to the river to take a cool swim, then got hungry and returned to the teepee at dinner time, noon. "When you finish eating," my uncle said, "go to our horses. Something might happen today. I feel it in the air." I hurried to Muskrat Creek and joined my younger brother, who was herding the family horses. By the time I reached the herd, I heard shouting in the village. People were yelling that white soldiers were riding toward the camp. I climbed Black Butte for a look around the country. I saw a long column of soldiers coming and a large party of Hunkpapa warriors, led by Sitting Bull's nephew, One Bull, riding out to meet them. I could see One Bull's hand raised in the peace sign to show the soldiers that our leaders only wanted to talk them into going away and leaving us alone. But all at once the soldiers spread out for attack and began to fire, and the light was on. I caught my favorite war pony, a small buckskin Mustang I called Little Yellow Horse, and raced him back to camp to get ready for battle. I had no time to paint Zichishila properly for making war. Just a minute or so to braid his tail and to daub a few white hail spots of paint on my own forehead for protection before I galloped out on the little buckskin to help defend the camp. I met 4 other Lakotas riding fast. 3 were veteran fighters armed with rifles. The other was young like me and carried a bow and arrows as I did. One of the veterans went down. I saw my chance to act bravely and filled the gap. We all turned when we heard shooting at the far side of the village nearest the Miniconjou camp circle and rode fast to meet this new danger. I could see swirls of dust and hear shooting on the hills and bluffs across the river. Hundreds of other warriors joined us as we splashed across the ford near our camp and raced up the hills to charge into the thickest of the fighting. This new battle was a turmoil of dust and warriors and soldiers, with bullets whining and arrows hissing all around. Sometimes a bugle would sound and the shooting would get louder. Some of the soldiers were firing pistols at close range. Our knives and war clubs flashed in the sun. I could hear bullets whiz past my ears, but I kept going and shouting, "It's a good day to die," so that everyone who heard would know I was not afraid of being killed in battle. Then a Lakota named Spotted Rabbit rode unarmed among us, calling out a challenge to all the warriors to join him. He shouted, "Let's take their leader alive." I had no thought of what we would do with this leader once we caught him, It was a daring feat that required more courage and much more skill than killing him. I dug my heels into my pony's flanks to urge him on faster to take part in the capture. A tall white man in buckskins kept shouting at the soldiers and looked to be their leader. Following Spotted Rabbit, I charged toward this leader in buckskins. We were almost on top of him when Spotted Rabbit's pony was shot from under him. Zichishila shied to one side, and it was too late. A mini Kanju named Charging Hawk rushed in and shot the leader at close range. In a little while, all the soldiers were dead. The battle was over. The soldier chief we had tried to capture lay on the ground with the reins of his horse's bridle tied to his wrist. It was a fine animal, a blaze-faced sorrel with 4 white stockings. A Santee named Walks Under the Ground took that Custer's horse. Then he told everyone that the leader lying there dead was Long Hair. So that was the first I knew who we had been fighting. One thought it was a strange name for a soldier chief who had his hair cut short. Note: Lazy White Bull said the Santee who got Custer's horse was named Sound the Ground as he walks, which is also sometimes translated as noisy walking. Our attempt to save Longhair's life had failed, but we all felt good about our victory over the soldiers and celebrated with a big scalp dance. But our triumph was hollow. A winter or so later, more soldiers came to round us up on reservations. There were too many of them to fight now. We were split up into bands and no longer felt strong. At last, we were ready for peace and believed we would have no more trouble.